Welcome back to the complete online dressage course by howtodressage.com. We're continuing it on with the dressage scales of training, and in this presentation we're looking at scale 5, which is straightness. So in this presentation we're going to look at why is straightness 5th on the scale. We're going to look at why straightness is important, how you can tell if your horse is straight. We're going to take a deeper dive and look at functional straightness and absolute straightness. We're also going to look at straightness in the walk, trot and canter, and straightness around circles. So here is your quick recap of the dressage scales of training pyramid. Now, straightness is probably the most difficult of the scales to place in terms of the order. Now, although yes, it is 5th on the scale, it's also quite integral to achieving the earlier scales. Now, in other words, all these scales are interlinked, and this is probably the most obvious example of that. Now, we are going to come back to that issue in a moment, but first, let's take a look at what straightness is. So here is the FEI definition, and the FEI is the International Governing Body for Equestrian Sport. And they say that the horse is straight when his forehand is in line with his hindquarters. That is, when his longitudinal axis is in line with the straight or curve line that he is following. Now, to simplify that definition just a little bit, just picture your horse's spine. You want that to line up to the line that you are following, whether that be a straight line, a centre line, a circle, a corner, etc. So why exactly is straightness 5th in the scales of training? Because surely you would think that being straight would be something to teach the horse as soon as possible. Well, let's consider the preceding scales of rhythm, suppleness, contact and impulsion. Now, the correct rhythm in all the paces for a dressage horse is essential, so it's paramount that that should be established first. Now, in that rhythm, the horse should swing through a supple back into an elastic even contact with active hind quarters. Now, only when the rider can achieve all of these elements, these first 4 training scales, can they then make the horse truly straight. However, in order for the horse to accomplish those first 4 training scales, the horse must be able to demonstrate a basic level of straightness. Because it's no good if the horse's hindquarters swing off in one direction and the shoulders go off in another direction. So although straightness may not be a big priority in the early stages, you need to start paying attention to it from the get-go. Now, straightening natural crookedness does take months and even years of persistent work. And although you might not fully achieve it until the horse is relatively advanced, you do need to work on it as an underlying issue pretty much as soon as your basic controls are established. But only once the first 4 scales of that rhythm, suppleness, contact and impulsion are established can you then work on refining straightness and making the horse truly straight. So now let's move on to take a look at why is straightness important? Why are we trying to make our horses straight? Well, horses by nature are not straight, and there are a few theories as to why this is. One of the theories is that when the horse is formed as a foal, it's curled up to one side in the womb and so develops one-sided. I don't know if this has been proven or disproven, but it is a theory. Another theory is that we do everything from the horse's left side. So we lead him from the left, we tack him up from the left, we get on and off from the left, and this therefore makes him one-sided. Also, horses are built horizontally, so therefore their lack of straightness is more obvious, as opposed to our lack of straightness because we are built vertically. But this asymmetry is normal in all animals. But whatever the reason for his natural crookedness, we need to make him straighter, and we do it through correct schooling, we're basically aiming to make our horse ambidextrous. But the question is, why? If they're naturally not straight, why are we trying to make them straight? Well, here are 2 reasons why. So, reason number 1 is that through developing the even weight distribution on both sides of the horse, we help him to maintain health and soundness for ridden work, because we promote equal wear and tear on the muscles, tendons, joints and ligaments of both sides. And this makes logical sense, because if we are asking the horse to carry the weight of a rider and equipment, if he can do that evenly, then he is less likely to sustain an injury. So moving on to reason number 2 for why we want the horse to be straight, it is to prepare the horse for collection. Because only a straight horse using both his hind legs equally and taking even weight in both sides of the contact can engage his hindquarters sufficiently under his body to transfer more weight carriage to his rear end and therefore lighten his forehand to achieve true collection, which is the final of the training scales. In essence, if a horse is not straight, you will not be able to achieve true collection. So let's move on now to talk about how can you tell if your horse is straight. Well, here are some key points to help you identify straightness. So firstly, when the horse is straight, you will have an equal weight of contact in both of your hands, and you should also feel equal weight in your seat bones and also in your stirrups. Now also, the horse will be able to bend equally on both sides. So as you can see from that last point, straightness and suppleness is linked. And this is your horse's ability to align his spine to the track that he is following. So if you can improve your horse's lateral suppleness, which is his side-to-side suppleness, then you will also be able to make the horse straighter. But moving on, here is another identifier for you. So when the horse is straight, both of the horse's hind legs have equal pushing power in the direction of movement. And also, when you are riding, if you look at your horse's head, his ears should appear to be level. His head should not tilt at the poll, especially when you go around circles or through corners. Now also, when you're riding circles and turns, your horse should not fall in or fall out. And if your horse is straight, your horse's hind legs should follow in the footprints of your horse's forelegs, unless of course you're riding laterally. Now a good way to test that is to ride into an arena that has just been freshly rolled. And you could ride a centre line or a circle or even just on the outside track. Once you've ridden that line, go back and have a look at it. If your horse is straight, you should be able to see just one track of prints. Right, so now we've covered the basics of straightness. You know how to tell if your horse is straight, you know why we want the horse to be straight, but there are 2 types of straightness, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So there's absolute straightness and there is functional straightness, and we're going to take a look at both of them individually. So let's begin by first looking at absolute straightness. Now, when we talk about straightness, this is probably the type of straightness that everybody thinks of. And this is when you want your horse's spine to be totally aligned to the line which you are riding. So it's from his head, along his neck, along his back, into his hindquarters and tail, with no part of his body deviating from that line. And this is what you are trying to achieve on a centre line. But now let's look at the next type of straightness. So this is functional straightness. Now, one thing to note about the way the horse is built is that your horse's hips are wider than his shoulders. Now, this means that if you ride on soft ground and you look at the imprints of the horse's front and hind feet, you will see that the front feet land on the ground slightly closer together than the hind feet. So although when we talk about straightness and alignment, we talk about the front and the hind hooves travelling on the same lines, it's not quite possible. So, functional straightness describes when you have the two hooves on the front and back of one side travelling along the same line. And this is what's known as functional straightness, and it's basically what you are trying to achieve in the canter. Now we're going to cover the canter more in depth in a moment, but for now just note that functional straightness is when you have those two hooves on the same side travelling on the same track. Okay, so now let's take a look at straightness in the walk, the trot and the canter and how we go about achieving it. Now before we get into this first slide of this section, you need to first make sure that you are sitting straight and that your weight is evenly distributed over your seat bones, because you can't expect your horse to stay straight if you are sitting to one side. Now we do cover this more in depth in the rider module of this course, where we look at rider positioning and rider balance. But just note that whatever tips we give you on improving straightness in the walk, trot and canter, they will all be useless unless you are sitting straight yourself. But assuming that you are, let's get on with the rest of this presentation. So firstly, we're going to be looking at straightness in the walk. Now one thing to note is that the slower the pace, the more likely it is that your horse will become crooked. Now obviously the walk is the slowest pace, and because the horse's hindquarters are wider than his shoulders, as we discovered a few slides back, this gives the horse more opportunity to wiggle and crab in the walk. Now the best way to fix this and the best way to keep your horse straight is to keep the walk moving forwards and to encourage the horse to work into the contact. Now if you imagine trying to ride a bicycle very slowly in a straight line, you'll notice that the less speed you have, the more likely it is that you are to wobble. Now if you pedal faster, then this solves that problem instantly, and it all of a sudden becomes easier to ride the bicycle in a straight line. This is the same principle with your horse. So if you keep the walk moving forwards, it's more likely that it's going to stay straight. Now, if the horse does come against the hand, then this will cause the quarters to swing out. So you need to make sure that your contact is light and remains elastic so that that doesn't happen. But if it does happen, then just allow with the hands ever so slightly and ride the horse forward to help correct the straightness. Now the last thing to note is that too much neck bend will cause the horse's shoulder to bulge out and for him to fall out through his outside shoulder. Now that last point is universal. That will happen regardless of whatever pace you are travelling in. However, riders tend to overbend the neck more in walk than they do in the trot and canter, so it's just something that you need to pay attention to. But overall, in order to keep the walk straight, you just need to keep the horse relaxed and working forwards in a regular 4-beat rhythm. So now let's move on to look at straightness in the trot. Now this is much easier than the walk because it's much easier to ride the horse forwards. So quite simply, all you need to do is keep both your legs on equally, ride forwards into an even rein contact down both reins. Keep your hands at the same height, thumbs on top, and make sure that they're carried as a pair. And assuming that you are also sitting straight, that's pretty much all there is to it. Now, when it comes to the canter, this is a little bit more difficult because opposed to the walk and trot, canter brings an added complication to straightness. Now, horses naturally travel slightly quarters in during canter, and this is due to the natural canter sequence, where the legs on one side, so the leading side, are always moving in advance of the legs on the outside of the body. So the horse's spine is always predisposed to curling up towards the leading leg. Now this is why judges often comment that a horse is quarters in during canter. Now, to prevent this natural crookedness, you should always ride canter with a very slight feeling of shoulder fore. But basically, you're aiming to have the 2 feet on the leading side aligned so that the horse's nose is positioned above his inside knee. So if we look at this picture, this is what tends to happen when the horse just naturally canters. Those quarters come on into the inside, and that's literally just due to the natural sequence of the canter. So what we're aiming to do is to move that inside forefoot to line up with the inside hindfoot. Therefore, we want to make the horse functionally straight. If you remember the difference between the width of your horse's shoulders and his hips, then you will see why you must move the shoulders slightly in to put that hoof directly in front of the corresponding hind hoof. And this is why canter should always be ridden with the aim of functional straightness. Now, what you don't want to do to correct this is you don't want to try to push the quarters across, because that will unbalance the horse, and what will most likely happen is he'll swing his quarters too far in the opposite direction, and you end up playing haunches ping pong, pushing his quarters from one side to the next. So you should always correct this by placing the shoulders in front of the hind foot and not the other way around. Right, so finally, let's take a look at straightness around circles. This is where people get quite confused when it comes to the word straight. Now, although it sounds slightly contradictory, you want your horse to remain straight as he moves around a circle, through a turn, or through a corner. Now, as previously mentioned, straightness is when the horse moves along one track. You want your horse's spine to be totally aligned to the line that he is following. The same applies to when the horse rides a curve or a circle. You want the spine totally aligned to the line that you are following, along his neck, along his back, into his quarters and his tail, with no part of his body deviating from the line. The same applies to this bend as well. Even though the horse is on quite a tight circle and is obviously bent, the horse is still described as being straight because his body is in alignment. His hind feet are following in the tracks left by his front feet. So as you can see, this is where suppleness is obviously needed for straightness, especially this lateral suppleness, this side-to-side dexterity. And the smaller the circle you are riding, the more suppleness is required from the horse to keep his body in alignment and therefore straight. So if you are struggling to keep your horse straight through corners and circles and turns, then go back and watch the presentation that we did on suppleness, which was Scale 2 within the Dressage Scales of Training module. And also, if you are continuing with the rest of the course, you can also watch the presentation that we have coming up later on, where we look at circles, bending and flexion, and how to ask your horse to bend correctly, and therefore help him stay straight. So, to summarise this presentation, straightness is the 5th scale in the Dressage Scales of Training. Now, you need to work on it as soon as your basic controls are established, but you can only really achieve true straightness when those scales 1 to 4 are cemented. That's when you can refine the straightness further. But straightness is essential for equal wear and tear and weight distribution, and also to prepare the horse for collection. Now, straightness is essential if the horse is to complete the Dressage Scales of Training and achieve the goal of training, which is the ability to collect. It's that redistribution of the weight carriage of the horse and rider more towards the hind quarters to lighten and mobilise the forehand, removing that excess weight from the more vulnerable front legs, and therefore promoting health and soundness. That can only happen if the horse is straight. Now, there is also the absolute straightness and the functional straightness. Functional straightness is what we try to aim for when we ride in canter. Now, in order for the horse to be straight, he must also be supple. supple and straightness are interlinked because it's your horse's ability to align his spine to the track that he is following. Therefore, improving your horse's lateral suppleness will also make him straighter. Now, this presentation was brought to you by How to Dressage. If you would like to continue with this course, please visit course.howtodressage.com. Thank you very much for watching.